When catastrophic engine failure threatens 236 lives at 33,000 feet, a routine commercial pilot executes impossible maneuvers that defy civilian training. F-22 escorts monitoring the emergency discover her secret through military databases. She's not just Captain Chen, she's Viper, a legendary Top Gun instructor who disappeared from naval aviation. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The Boeing 777-300ER pushed back from Gate C-47 at Boston Logan International Airport at precisely 6:47 a.m., 17 minutes ahead of schedule. Captain Sarah Viper Chen completed her final pre-taxi checklist with the methodical efficiency that had defined her 8 years flying commercial routes for Transcontinental Airways, her movements economical and practiced as she verified hydraulic pressures, fuel quantities, and navigation settings. The first officer beside her, Marcus Webb, a competent 28-year-old pilot working toward his captain upgrade, made casual conversation about the weather system developing over the Great Lakes as they received their taxi clearance from ground control. Sarah responded with professional courtesy, discussing the forecast headwinds that might add 12 minutes to their flight time to Los Angeles, giving no indication that she'd once calculated wind corrections while inverted at 40,000 feet, engaging adversary aircraft at supersonic speeds with her life depending on split-second tactical decisions. The passengers boarding Flight 2847 treated her exactly as they treated every commercial pilot, with polite indifference or casual friendliness reserved for the professional who would deliver them safely to their destination. A businessman in first class asked about turbulence expectations as she performed her customary walkthrough, and she assured him the ride should be smooth after they climbed above the weather layer. A mother traveling with 2 young children thanked her for the on-time departure, mentioning they had a tight connection in Los Angeles. Sarah smiled warmly and promised they'd do everything possible to maintain their schedule, her demeanor reflecting nothing of the combat missions she'd flown over hostile territory, the carrier landings she'd executed in rolling seas with zero visibility, or the adversary pilots she'd outmaneuvered during her years as one of the Navy's most decorated fighter pilots. Her transition to commercial aviation had been deliberate and carefully constructed. After 12 years flying F-18 Super Hornets, including a tour as a Top Gun instructor at Naval Air Station Fallon where she'd earned the call sign Viper for her lethal precision in air combat maneuvering, Sarah had walked away from military aviation for reasons she'd never fully explained to anyone except her closest squadron mates. The official story in her Transcontinental Airways personnel file showed a progression through civilian flight training, regional airline experience, and steady advancement through the ranks, a manufactured history that satisfied human resources requirements while concealing her actual background. Her military records remained classified under protocols that protected former Top Gun instructors transitioning to civilian life, and she'd specifically requested that her naval aviation career remain sealed from public access. The few people who knew her real history understood she'd made the transition for personal reasons connected to a mission that had cost her something she couldn't recover in a cockpit, though she never discussed the details. Flying commercial routes between Boston and Los Angeles, Seattle and Miami, Chicago and San Francisco had become her new normal. The Boeing 777 handled nothing like an F-18, its massive weight and transport category certification requiring entirely different techniques than the fighter jet she'd commanded with instinctive precision. She'd adapted completely to commercial aviation's emphasis on passenger comfort, fuel efficiency, and schedule reliability rather than tactical superiority and combat effectiveness. Her fellow captains at Transcontinental considered her a solid, reliable pilot who flew by the book, maintained excellent crew resource management, and handled routine emergencies with calm professionalism. The airline's chief pilot had noted in her last evaluation that she demonstrated exceptional situational awareness and crisis management capabilities, though he attributed these qualities to natural aptitude rather than thousands of hours executing tactical maneuvers against some of the world's best fighter pilots. The departure from Boston proceeded exactly as planned. Sarah advanced the throttles smoothly, feeling the characteristic surge of the GE-90 engine spooling to takeoff power as the heavily loaded aircraft accelerated down runway 33 left. First Officer Webb called out the speed checks, 80 knots, V1, rotate, and Sarah pulled back gently on the yoke, lifting the 777's nose to the calculated pitch attitude for their weight and conditions. The aircraft lifted off smoothly, climbing into the cold morning air as the landing gear retracted with its characteristic thump and whir. She established the departure profile, following Boston's prescribed noise abatement procedures while ATC vectored them westbound toward their filed route. The cabin behind her held 236 passengers settling in for the 5.5-hour flight, most already absorbed in their devices, books, or anticipating the breakfast service that would begin once they reached cruise altitude. At flight level 330, 33,000 feet above the Pennsylvania landscape, Sarah engaged the autopilot and allowed herself a moment to appreciate the stark beauty of the winter morning. The sun broke over the horizon ahead, painting the cloud layers below in shades of gold and crimson that reminded her of sunrise carrier launches, though she pushed that memory aside as she focused on the present. The flight management system showed them exactly on schedule, fuel consumption tracking perfectly with their flight plan predictions. She and Webb discussed their families. He was expecting his first child in 3 months, and the upcoming schedule rotation that would give her 4 days off in San Diego where she kept a small apartment near the beach. Everything about Flight 2847 was routine, unremarkable, exactly the kind of smooth operation that commercial aviation demanded thousands of times daily. The first indication of trouble arrived without warning at 8:23 a.m., somewhere over eastern Indiana. Sarah was reviewing the descent planning for their Los Angeles arrival when the aircraft shuddered violently, accompanied by a sound like a massive explosion that reverberated through the fuselage. Every alarm in the cockpit activated simultaneously, master warnings, fire bells, multiple engine indications, creating a cacophony that would have overwhelmed most pilots. Sarah's hands moved with practiced precision, scanning instruments and verifying indications while Webb transmitted a mayday call to Indianapolis Center. The number 2 engine, the right engine on the twin-engine 777, showed catastrophic failure, with fire indications, complete loss of thrust, and rapidly deteriorating parameters. She pulled the fire handle, activating the engine fire suppression system while simultaneously beginning the emergency procedures committed to her memory through years of training. But the situation deteriorated far beyond a simple engine failure. Within seconds, her instruments showed cascading system failures that indicated the engine explosion had caused severe collateral damage. The number 2 hydraulic system showed zero pressure, which meant they'd lost critical flight control capability. Electrical indications showed generator failures beyond the expected loss from the failed engine. Most critically, fuel quantity indicators began dropping rapidly in the center tank, suggesting catastrophic fuel leak from shrapnel damage, a nightmare scenario that meant they were hemorrhaging thousands of pounds of fuel while facing an immediate forced landing situation. The aircraft began yawing hard to the right as the asymmetric thrust from the remaining engine tried to rotate them off their flight path, requiring constant corrective inputs to maintain directional control. Sarah's mind shifted into a mode she hadn't accessed in 8 years, the combat mentality that Top Gun training had hardwired into her neural pathways. Time seemed to slow as her brain processed multiple simultaneous emergencies with the tactical assessment capability she'd developed dogfighting against adversary aircraft. She recognized immediately that this wasn't a textbook emergency that commercial pilot training adequately addressed. This was a compound crisis requiring advanced airmanship that transcended procedural responses. The fuel leak meant they had perhaps 20 minutes of flying time before fuel exhaustion. The hydraulic failure meant degraded flight controls that would make any landing attempt extraordinarily difficult. The electrical failures meant they were losing instrumentation and automation systems that modern commercial pilots depended on. And they were carrying 236 souls over terrain offering limited emergency landing options. Webb was professional but clearly approaching task saturation as he worked through the emergency checklists while coordinating with air traffic control. Sarah's voice cut through the chaos with the calm authority she'd used commanding fighter divisions in combat situations. She told Webb exactly what she needed: notify ATC they required immediate vectors to the nearest suitable airport with emergency equipment standing by, declare an emergency with souls on board and remaining fuel, and have the flight attendants prepare the cabin for possible evacuation. Her tone carried absolute confidence that subordinated panic to focused action, a quality the Navy had refined through hundreds of high-stress training scenarios. Webb responded to her leadership, his own anxiety channeling into productive task completion as he transmitted their emergency status to Indianapolis Center. The controller's response offered Fort Wayne International Airport, 47 miles northeast, as their closest diversion. Sarah processed the information with tactical precision. Fort Wayne's runway was long enough for a 777, and the airport had commercial service with appropriate emergency response capabilities. But her calculations showed a problem. At their current fuel burn rate with the massive leak, they might not have enough time to execute a standard instrument approach and landing. The degraded hydraulic system meant their flight controls were operating in alternate mode with reduced responsiveness, which would complicate any approach profile. Most dangerously, the asymmetric thrust from only having the left engine required constant rudder input to prevent the aircraft from yawing into an uncontrolled spiral, and she could feel through the controls that this was becoming increasingly difficult to manage. She made a decision that no commercial pilot training would have suggested but that her fighter pilot instincts recognized as their only viable option. Instead of flying the published instrument approach procedures that would add critical minutes to their flying time, she would execute a tactical approach, a high-speed, high-angle descent directly to the runway using visual flying techniques that naval aviators practiced during carrier approaches. She told ATC she was canceling her instrument flight plan and requesting vectors for a straight-in visual approach with maximum priority handling. The controller, recognizing the severity of their situation, cleared all other traffic from Fort Wayne's airspace and provided direct routing to a 15-mile final approach for runway 23. What Sarah didn't tell anyone was that she was planning to fly an approach profile that would terrify every commercial passenger who understood what was happening. She would keep the aircraft at altitude to maximize their gliding capability if the remaining engine failed, then execute a steep descent that would bring them to the runway threshold with minimal maneuvering and minimal fuel consumption. The technique came directly from carrier aviation, where fighter pilots routinely flew precisely calculated approaches that terminated at specific points with minimal margin for error. The mental mathematics required to calculate the approach geometry, descent rate, and energy management happened automatically in her mind, muscle memory from hundreds of carrier approaches combining with her understanding of the 777's handling characteristics. She explained her plan to Webb in terms he could understand and support. They would maintain their current altitude of 33,000 feet until they were in position, then execute a rapid descent at maximum airspeed consistent with structural limitations, using the aircraft's potential energy to minimize fuel consumption. She would fly the approach manually, without autopilot assistance, using visual references and her own judgment rather than following instrument approach procedures. Webb's expression showed concern. This was far outside standard procedures, but he also recognized their limited options. He acknowledged her plan and prepared to support her by managing communications, monitoring their diminishing fuel quantity, and backing up her flying with his own instrument scan. The aircraft behind them had become a challenge of its own. Sarah had instructed the lead flight attendant, Jennifer Martinez, to prepare passengers for an emergency landing without creating mass panic. Over the public address system, she'd made an announcement in a calm, professional tone that passengers needed to hear, explaining they'd experienced an engine problem and would be making a precautionary landing at Fort Wayne. She deliberately understated the severity, telling passengers about the fuel leak, multiple system failures, and tactical approach profile would serve no purpose except to create terror. The flight attendants moved through the cabin securing loose items, demonstrating brace positions, and projecting the controlled urgency that would prepare people without overwhelming them with fear. At 6 minutes from Fort Wayne, with fuel quantity showing critical low levels in all tanks, Sarah began her descent. She pulled the throttle on the remaining engine back to idle, pitched the nose down to a steep angle that immediately triggered ground proximity warnings, and let the 777 accelerate to 350 knots, far faster than the normal descent speeds commercial passengers ever experienced. The rate of descent exceeded 4,000 feet per minute, creating a sensation like dropping in an elevator that brought immediate distress from the cabin behind her. Passenger call buttons illuminated across her overhead panel as people reacted to the alarming descent profile, but she ignored them, completely focused on managing their energy and position. Her eyes moved constantly between the windscreen and her instruments, cross-checking altitude, airspeed, and position with the same scan pattern she'd used flying tactical approaches to carrier decks. She could see Fort Wayne ahead in the distance, the airport clearly visible in the cold morning air. The approach required absolute precision. She needed to arrive at the runway threshold at exactly the right altitude, airspeed, and position to execute a landing with their degraded flight controls and minimal fuel remaining. There was no opportunity for a go-around if she misjudged the approach. They would have one chance to get this right, and any miscalculation would put 236 people at fatal risk. At 5,000 feet, still descending at an extreme rate, Sarah made a request that stunned the Fort Wayne approach controller. She wanted emergency flight following from military aircraft if any were available in the area. Her reasoning was tactical. Military pilots would understand what she was attempting and could provide valuable position information and emergency coordination that civilian controllers might not anticipate. The controller, responding to the urgency in her voice, contacted the North American Aerospace Defense Command, which had been monitoring the emergency situation developing over the Midwest. Two F-22 Raptor fighters from Toledo Air National Guard Base, already airborne on a routine training mission, received immediate tasking to intercept and escort Flight 2847. The Raptors, piloted by Major David Hawk Morrison and Captain Lisa Joker Tran, accelerated to supersonic speed and arrived in the vicinity within minutes. As they took up escort positions on either side of the descending 777, their advanced sensors immediately detected the extent of the damage. Thermal imaging showed the fuel streaming from the center tank, creating a visible vapor trail, while their systems identified the failed engine and multiple structural damage indicators. Hawk radioed that he had the commercial flight in sight and would provide escort and position information for their emergency landing. Sarah acknowledged the F-22 escort with professional courtesy, thanking them for their assistance. Her voice remained absolutely calm despite the growing difficulty of controlling the damaged aircraft. The asymmetric thrust was becoming harder to manage as they descended through different air densities, requiring constant rudder input that was fatiguing her right leg. The degraded hydraulic system meant the flight controls felt mushy and unresponsive, lacking the crisp feedback she needed for precision flying. The fuel quantity showed critical lows in all tanks, with warning lights indicating they might face fuel starvation at any moment. And she was bringing all of this toward a runway at speeds and descent rates that would horrify any commercial aviation safety inspector. As she rolled out on final approach, 4 miles from the runway, Hawk radioed a question that changed everything. His voice carried a note of uncertainty as he asked Fort Wayne Tower if they could confirm the commercial pilot's identity, because his aircraft's combat identification systems were showing something unexpected in the military database cross-reference. Sarah felt a cold spike of adrenaline. Somehow the F-22's advanced systems had queried military records using information from the 777's transponder or radio transmissions, and they'd found her classified background. She maintained her focus on the approach, knowing she couldn't afford any distraction, but she heard Hawk key his microphone again with a tone of absolute astonishment. The radio call went out on the emergency frequency that everyone was monitoring: tower, approach control, emergency responders, and the cockpit of Flight 2847. Hawk's voice carried genuine shock as he announced that the captain of the commercial flight in emergency wasn't just a civilian airline pilot. According to military records his system had accessed, she was Captain Sarah Chen, call sign Viper, a former F-18 Super Hornet pilot with 12 years of naval aviation service including tours in combat zones and advanced training at the Navy Fighter Weapons School, Top Gun. He reported that her records showed over 3,000 hours in tactical aircraft, 200 carrier landings, and a distinguished service record that included being a Top Gun instructor before her transition to civilian aviation. The F-22 pilot's announcement, transmitted openly because he assumed it was already public information since she was flying commercially, revealed the secret that Sarah had kept hidden throughout her civilian career. In the cockpit of Flight 2847, Webb's head snapped toward Sarah with an expression of complete shock. In the cabin behind them, passengers who'd been bracing for emergency landing suddenly were processing that their captain wasn't the standard commercial pilot they'd assumed but a combat-trained fighter pilot with elite military credentials. The flight attendants, monitoring the emergency frequency through their crew communication systems, exchanged stunned glances as they realized the woman they'd flown with dozens of times had a background none of them had suspected. And in the emergency command center at Fort Wayne, controllers and rescue coordinators suddenly understood why the commercial pilot was flying an approach profile that looked more like a military tactical maneuver than a civilian emergency landing. Sarah forced herself to ignore the revelation, channeling every ounce of her concentration into the final approach. She was at 500 feet, descending at 800 feet per minute, with airspeed at 160 knots, fast for a commercial landing but necessary given their degraded flight controls. The runway stretched ahead, and she could see emergency vehicles positioned along its length, lights flashing in the morning sun. The remaining engine was running smoothly, but the fuel quantity showed digital zeros across all tanks, meaning they were running on residual fuel that could quit at any instant. Her hands and feet made constant tiny corrections, fighting the asymmetric thrust and degraded controls to keep the massive aircraft aligned with the centerline. At 200 feet, she pulled the throttle fully to idle and began the flare, raising the nose to arrest their descent rate. The carrier landing training that had burned itself into her muscle memory took over. She was judging the touchdown point with the same precision she'd once used to catch the 3-wire on a carrier deck, adjusting her sight picture to ensure they contacted the runway at exactly the right spot with the right descent rate. The degraded hydraulics made the control inputs feel vague and imprecise, requiring larger movements than normal to achieve the desired aircraft response. She could hear Webb's breathing beside her, rapid and tense, but she remained in the zone that Top Gun training had created, where external stress dissolved into pure focus. The main landing gear contacted the runway with a firm thump that was harder than her typical commercial landing but perfectly controlled given the circumstances. She deployed the speed brakes immediately, aerodynamic panels that increased drag to help slow the aircraft. The critical moment came when she applied the thrust reversers. With only one engine operating, the reverse thrust would be asymmetric, trying to yaw them off the runway. She anticipated the effect, applying heavy rudder input to counteract the asymmetric forces while simultaneously using differential braking to maintain directional control. The 777 tracked straight down the runway's centerline as their speed decreased through 100 knots, 80 knots, 60 knots. At 40 knots, the remaining engine quit as the last fuel was exhausted. The sudden silence was startling after the sustained roar of the engine throughout their descent, but Sarah maintained her focus, using aerodynamic braking and gentle wheel braking to bring them to a complete stop. The aircraft settled onto its landing gear with a final gentle bounce, coming to rest 3,000 feet down the runway, surrounded immediately by emergency vehicles that had been tracking their approach. Sarah completed the emergency shutdown procedures, securing all systems while Webb sat beside her in stunned silence, his hands still gripping the armrests. The cabin behind them erupted in applause and emotional releases that ranged from crying to laughter to prayers of thanksgiving. The flight attendants, trained professionals who'd maintained composure throughout the emergency, now allowed themselves tears of relief as they realized everyone had survived what could easily have been a catastrophic disaster. Jennifer Martinez keyed her interphone to the cockpit, her voice breaking with emotion as she thanked the captain for saving their lives. Sarah acknowledged briefly, her own voice steady though she felt the post-adrenaline tremors beginning in her hands, the physiological response she remembered from combat missions. The F-22 escorts made low passes over the airport, a salute from one military aviator to another, before receiving clearance to return to their base. But before departing, Hawk made one final radio transmission on the emergency frequency, his voice carrying profound respect as he addressed Sarah directly. He said that the approach she'd flown, using energy management and tactical descent profiles to maximize their survivability while managing multiple cascading emergencies, was exactly the kind of airmanship that Top Gun taught but that few pilots ever had to demonstrate in actual life-or-death situations. He noted that the combination of combat flying skills applied to a damaged commercial aircraft, with 236 lives depending on precision execution, represented exactly why the Navy's elite fighter weapons school existed, to create aviators capable of the impossible when ordinary training wasn't sufficient. The emergency evacuation proceeded smoothly, with passengers using the deployed escape slides to exit the aircraft onto the runway where buses waited to transport them to the terminal. Many paused to look back at the damaged 777, seeing for the first time the extent of the destruction, the failed engine showing massive internal damage, the scorched wing structure around the engine mount, and the continuous trail of fuel that marked their entire approach path. They understood with sudden clarity how close they'd come to disaster, and how the pilot they'd barely noticed during boarding had used skills far beyond normal commercial aviation to save every person aboard. The media descended on Fort Wayne within hours, transforming the emergency landing into a national story that captured public imagination. The narrative of a decorated combat fighter pilot who'd hidden her military background while flying commercial routes, only to use her elite Top Gun training to save 236 passengers during a catastrophic emergency, became headline news across every platform. Reporters discovered that Sarah had served 2 combat deployments, earned multiple air medals for tactical excellence, and had been recognized as one of the Navy's most skilled fighter pilots before transitioning to civilian aviation. Her former commanding officers and squadron mates provided interviews praising her airmanship and leadership, though they respected her privacy regarding the specific reasons she'd left military aviation. The Federal Aviation Administration investigation confirmed that Sarah's tactical approach, while unconventional by commercial standards, had been the optimal response given the multiple system failures and fuel emergency. Investigators noted that a standard instrument approach following published procedures would have resulted in fuel exhaustion before reaching the runway, leading to a catastrophic crash. Her decision to use high-altitude energy management and a steep tactical descent, combined with precision visual flying that brought them to the runway threshold at exactly the right position and energy state, demonstrated airmanship that exceeded what civilian pilot training typically provided. The investigation concluded that her Top Gun background had directly contributed to the successful outcome, as the tactical flying skills and crisis management capabilities taught at the Navy Fighter Weapons School had given her tools that saved lives. Transcontinental Airways faced difficult questions about why they hadn't known about Sarah's military background, though her classified status and the deliberate concealment of her records meant the airline couldn't have discovered her history through standard hiring processes. The chief pilot who'd evaluated her performance recognized in hindsight that the exceptional situational awareness and crisis management capabilities he'd noted in her evaluations were products of elite military training rather than natural aptitude. The airline ultimately decided to celebrate her heroism rather than focus on the hidden background, issuing statements praising her professionalism and skill while respecting her privacy regarding her reasons for transitioning to commercial aviation. For Sarah, the unwanted publicity forced her to confront the past she'd carefully compartmentalized. She gave a single press conference, appearing in her Transcontinental Airways uniform rather than military dress, where she briefly acknowledged her naval aviation career while emphasizing that what happened on Flight 2847 wasn't about her background but about the training and experience that all professional pilots bring to their work. She deflected questions about why she'd left the Navy and why she'd hidden her Top Gun credentials, stating only that she'd made personal choices about her career path that she preferred to keep private. Her bearing during the press conference, calm, professional, refusing to dramatize or seek glory, reflected the same quiet confidence that had characterized her military service. The passengers she'd saved had different perspectives on the revelation. Some felt betrayed that she'd hidden such significant qualifications, though most recognized that her privacy was her right and that what mattered was her competence rather than her biography. Many sought her out to thank her personally, expressing gratitude not just for her flying skills but for the calm leadership she'd demonstrated during the crisis. The businessman from first class who'd asked about turbulence expectations wrote her a letter describing how her voice over the public address system, steady and confident even as they executed the terrifying descent, had kept him from panicking when he understood something was seriously wrong. The mother traveling with children sent a photograph of her family, thanking Sarah for giving them the chance to continue their lives. Webb, who'd flown dozens of flights with Sarah without suspecting her background, struggled to process the revelation. In conversations after the emergency, he admitted feeling inadequate, wondering if she'd been silently judging his flying while maintaining the pretense of being just another commercial captain. Sarah addressed his concerns directly, explaining that she'd never viewed commercial aviation as inferior to military flying. They were different disciplines requiring different skills, and she respected the professionalism that civilian pilots brought to their work. She told him that his performance during the emergency had been exactly what she needed, providing calm support and competent backup that had allowed her to focus on flying while he managed communications and systems. Her words helped him understand that her hidden background hadn't been about superiority but about making a clean break from a part of her life she'd needed to leave behind. The Navy reached out through quiet channels, offering to restore her active duty status if she wanted to return to military aviation. The offer came from former squadron mates who'd known her as Viper and remembered her tactical brilliance, suggesting she could return to Top Gun as an instructor or take a position in tactical development where her experience would benefit the next generation of fighter pilots. Sarah considered the offer seriously, recognizing that the public revelation of her background had eliminated the anonymity that had made civilian aviation appealing. But ultimately she declined, explaining that she'd made her decision to transition away from military flying for reasons that remained valid regardless of her current circumstances. What she didn't explain, even to those who knew her best, was that the mission that had driven her from the Navy had involved losing a wingman during a combat engagement, a young pilot she'd been responsible for as his flight lead, who died because of a tactical decision she'd made under impossible circumstances. The official investigation had cleared her of any wrongdoing, recognizing that she'd faced a situation with no good options and had made the best choice available given the information she possessed. But the emotional weight of that loss had made it impossible for her to continue flying combat aircraft, where every training mission reminded her of the pilot who wouldn't be coming home. Commercial aviation had offered her a way to continue flying without the burden of combat responsibility, allowing her to use her skills while avoiding the tactical decisions that had cost her so dearly. The emergency at Fort Wayne had forced her to use those tactical skills again, demonstrating that she couldn't entirely escape her fighter pilot identity. The steep descent and precision approach that had saved 236 lives had required her to think like a combat aviator, making calculated risk decisions and executing maneuvers that commercial training didn't address. In that crisis, she'd proven that the capabilities Top Gun had built into her neural pathways remained intact, ready to deploy when circumstances demanded extraordinary airmanship. But she'd also proven that those skills could be applied to saving lives rather than combat operations, using her tactical training for protection rather than warfare. The 236 passengers aboard Flight 2847 returned to their lives carrying the knowledge that they'd been saved by someone extraordinary who'd chosen ordinariness. The businessmen catching connections, the mother traveling with children, the retirees visiting family, the students heading home for break, all of them had boarded expecting a routine flight with a standard captain, and all of them had survived a catastrophic emergency because that captain possessed skills that transcended normal expectations. Some struggled with the randomness of their good fortune, wondering what would have happened if a different pilot had been scheduled for their flight. Others felt profound gratitude for Sarah's decision to continue flying commercially, recognizing that her choice to apply her elite training in civilian aviation had directly saved their lives. Transcontinental Airways eventually assigned Sarah to a special role as a chief training captain, where she could share her crisis management expertise and advanced airmanship with other pilots without having to fly regular routes that would attract media attention. The position allowed her to continue contributing to aviation safety while maintaining some privacy, teaching emergency procedures and tactical decision-making to pilots who would hopefully never face situations requiring such skills but who would be better prepared if they did. She approached the training role with the same dedication she'd brought to being a Top Gun instructor, recognizing that sharing knowledge was its own form of service. The F-22 pilots who'd escorted her during the emergency became unexpected friends. Hawk and Joker reached out after the media attention subsided, wanting to connect with a fellow aviator who understood the unique demands of flying high-performance aircraft under extreme conditions. They shared stories over coffee at a military base near Sarah's home, comparing fighter aviation experiences and discussing the challenges of translating military flying skills to other contexts. The Raptor pilots expressed deep respect for what Sarah had accomplished, noting that successfully landing a damaged commercial aircraft with 236 souls aboard required airmanship that equaled any combat mission achievement. In the years that followed the emergency, Flight 2847 became a case study in aviation schools worldwide, analyzed not for dramatic effect but for the genuine lessons it offered about crisis management, tactical decision-making, and the value of diverse aviation backgrounds. Instructors taught that the combination of different flying experiences, combat aviation, carrier operations, elite tactical training, created capabilities that could prove invaluable during extraordinary circumstances that exceeded normal training parameters. Sarah's decision to execute a tactical approach rather than following standard procedures became a teaching example of adaptive thinking and situational awareness that prioritized successful outcomes over procedural compliance. The physical aircraft, once repaired and returned to service, carried a quiet notation in its maintenance logs documenting the emergency and successful landing. Transcontinental Airways considered permanently retiring the aircraft as a memorial to the event but ultimately decided that returning it to service honored both the aircraft's resilience and Sarah's skillful flying. Passengers who subsequently flew on that specific 777 often didn't know its history, though some crew members would quietly mention to curious travelers that they were flying on the aircraft that Viper had saved, using her Top Gun skills to accomplish the impossible. For Sarah, the revelation of her background ultimately brought a form of peace she hadn't expected. The burden of hiding her military identity had been its own weight, requiring constant vigilance about what she revealed and maintaining separation between her past and present. Having that separation involuntarily removed during the emergency had initially felt like a violation, but over time she recognized that integrating her complete identity, fighter pilot and commercial aviator, combat veteran and civilian professional, Viper and Captain Chen, allowed her to be more fully herself than the compartmentalization had permitted. She occasionally visited naval air stations, speaking to pilots transitioning to civilian aviation about the challenges and opportunities that awaited them beyond military service. Her message emphasized that military aviation training provided extraordinary capabilities but that civilian flying offered its own satisfactions and importance. She encouraged transitioning pilots to view commercial aviation not as a step down from combat flying but as a different application of their skills, where precision, professionalism, and commitment to safety protected lives in ways equally valuable to military operations. Some listened skeptically, doubting that commercial flying could match the intensity of fighter operations, but others understood that her words came from someone who'd successfully navigated both worlds. The passengers she'd saved gradually faded back into their lives, though many maintained an altered perspective on the professionals who operated the complex systems they depended on daily. They'd learned that the captain making routine announcements about flight times and weather might possess extraordinary capabilities hidden beneath professional ordinariness, that competence and heroism didn't require publicity or recognition, and that elite training created reservoirs of skill that remained available even when circumstances changed. Some became advocates for better recognition of commercial pilots' expertise, arguing that society undervalued the professionals responsible for millions of safe flights annually. The broader aviation community absorbed the lessons from Flight 2847 into their ongoing efforts to improve safety and training. Airlines recognized that pilots brought diverse backgrounds and experiences that might not be immediately apparent in their personnel files but that could prove invaluable during emergencies exceeding standard training parameters. The Federal Aviation Administration incorporated elements of tactical flying and combat decision-making into advanced pilot training programs, recognizing that the crisis management skills military aviation developed had applications beyond combat operations. These changes happened quietly, without dramatic announcements, reflecting the profession's commitment to continuous improvement. Sarah continued flying, her identity now integrated rather than compartmentalized, her past and present unified rather than separated. She remained the same professional aviator she'd always been, executing flights with precision and calm competence, but without the burden of maintaining a hidden history. Passengers who recognized her name sometimes expressed nervousness or excessive confidence in her abilities, but most treated her with the normal courtesy reserved for competent professionals, exactly as she preferred. She'd proven during one extraordinary morning over Indiana that elite training and combat experience could save lives in any aircraft, but she valued equally the thousands of routine flights she'd execute where those skills remained dormant, invisible capabilities protecting passengers who would never know how prepared their captain was for emergencies they would hopefully never face. The morning sun continued rising over airports across the country, illuminating runways where commercial flights departed and arrived with reassuring regularity. Among the thousands of pilots executing those flights were former military aviators who transitioned to civilian aviation, bringing with them capabilities and experiences that remained mostly hidden but potentially invaluable. Sarah Chen, call sign Viper, was one among many, exceptional in her specific achievements but representative of a broader truth, that professionalism, skill, and dedication transcended the boundaries between military and civilian aviation, and that the capabilities required to protect lives during extraordinary circumstances could be found in unexpected places, ready to deploy when circumstances demanded the impossible.